Yeah, yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit and look at how you carry your voice and your brand through all your work. So you make jewelry, you paint, and now you've just launched into designing scarves and pillows. So there's almost like four different things going on. Um,
Yeah.
so talk a little bit about, and I would imagine that even your process in creating those pieces is different and requires some varying mental shifts. So maybe start with how do you notice your creative process varying from each one of those mediums that you're working in?
Yeah, so one of the things is that I don't try to do everything at once. I don't try to work on everything at once. So it's not like, I have all these things and then I have designing an MBA and the courses that I run, and it's not like I wake up every day and I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend an hour on this and then an hour on that. And then, because that doesn't work. Like, my brain doesn't work like that. Like, it's too much jumping. So for me, it's really like I just dive into like what makes sense. So there might only be like 2 or 3 weeks out of the year where I'm designing jewelry. Right now I've been working on the textiles, so I haven't really been painting. But I noticed that there is definitely differences in the processes in terms of like what I'm thinking about for the outcomes. So for my paintings, that's really probably my most like playful process, where it's very rare that I have like any kind of end goal in mind. So like I go, and I paint like my paintings are very abstract. So there's not really like, okay, like today I'm going to paint a bird. It's like, I'm like, oh, these 3 colors look really pretty today. Like, let's go. And then I just start kind of putting things on canvases and kind of just playing around. So there's not a lot there, and that's sort of like been my release. Whereas when I'm designing, say, something like, jewelry, that's very much like an evolutionary process for me. So here's what I have in the line, like here's what I feel like is missing, or like, wouldn't it be cool if we tried this or that or the other thing? And then with something like the scarves, I've really been trying to think about like, very much about wearability and kind of, so there I'm thinking about like how someone's going to wear it, and then the play kind of comes in with like, okay, well I have this idea, now I could do it like this way or that way, which obviously you can relate to also making scarves. And then, yeah, and then, oh, there's my dog. And then, and then the pillows are kind of a little bit of like a funny thing because they're just like, so such a natural extension of like, okay, it's a painting and now it becomes a pillow, but I am, try to think about things like what fabric choices are going with it because I'm, using 2 different sides. So I am thinking, and like what kind of shape and scale. So that I'm much more thinking just about like an end product. So there is a lot of variation in what kind of goes on in my brain.
Right. And for people that don't know, Megan actually takes her paintings and she's turning them into the fabric, and that's what she's using to do the scarves and the pillows.
Yeah. And I see myself as the textile line evolves. It's been pretty much a process so far of taking paintings that I've already made, and being like, that one would be cool as fabric, let's do it. But I see myself in the future now coming to apparently my phone really wants me to go for a walk. See guys, I wasn't lying about that afternoon walk thing, but I already went, it's cool. So, I think in the future now, as I'm becoming kind of a little bit more serious isn't the right word, but like committed to the textile designs, I'll see myself actually stepping to my painting sometime, actually thinking about like, okay, how can I create something that's going to translate well to fabric? So I think there's going to start to be a little bit more give and take there as time goes on.
Cool. So I wanted to talk about, as you were, the paintings are your most kind of playful. How do you decide when they're finished? Because I think that's a big thing people struggle with. And, jewelry you can still sort of fight with, well, I could add a few more things. But I think especially, a pillow's kind of done when it looks like a pillow. I mean, I'm sure there's some more crazy things you could do to it, but it's a little bit clearer.
Yeah.
But how do you know when a painting's done?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, especially with abstract paintings. And what I've found is that there's this like there's like this moment where like it can look good, and then like the next moment it can be a disaster. So a lot of times I let myself, like if I like it, I let myself stop and let it sit for a while. Like, okay, if I like it, it gets to sit kind of over here in this area, and then I'll come back to it, like in a couple of days or a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, and be like, oh, you know what? Like, I do still really like it, so I think it's finished. Or, oh, you know what, I think it needs something, so maybe I can keep working. And actually, one of the little tricks that I've been using now when I'm kind of stuck on a painting is I'll take a picture of it and pull it into my iPad into an app where I can then like draw over it to be like, okay, well, what if I actually added like some of this here or some of that? So I've started playing with that a little bit to kind of safely take stuff to the next step. And I think for me, the bigger thing that I'm realizing is like, not how you know when a painting is finished, but how do you know when a painting is a lost cause? Which for me has been a really, really kind of big thing of being like, you know what? Like, I'm not going to save this. It's just going to keep getting like worse and worse and worse. And probably the best thing I can do is like gesso over it and just pretend it never happened. So I think that's sort of the bigger thing is, and for me, it's really just like, if I like it, it's done. If I don't like it, it's not. But I will also say too that like I take in a lot of visual information. So I have I have a pretty strong design sense. I just have a big design background. So I think if you don't have that, the more that you can bring in, the easier it becomes to make decisions that, I hate the word intuition because I don't think that it's intuition. I think it's actually wisdom. So if you don't have that kind of aesthetic experience or that design background or something to kind of draw on in the back of your brain, it can be really hard to know that it's done. So for me, I can pull on kind of those deep reserves and be like, yeah, that looks good. Or like, no, it doesn't quite work. So I would say, if you're really struggling with something like that, go out and get some more of that information, that education, bring more of that into your brain because that can make a big difference.
And I think even with that, it's important. I think sometimes people are like, they're afraid to look at other artists' work because they think they're going to copy them. For one, if you are a painter, you don't have to stare at all the other abstract painters. You can look at all different art forms and still be getting informed about, what a good composition looks like and, what a just finished piece looks like. So if you're afraid of that, then just choose different mediums. You can still become informed from them. And, if you make a piece and it sort of looks like you copied someone, so what? Like, just keep that for yourself and keep moving on and pushing through. I was studying, I think it was Jasper Johns in college. And then I went and did a very abstract mixed media weaving, and when you're weaving you can only see about a foot at a time, and this was like a 12-foot piece. I took it off the loom and it looked like so much like one of his pieces, which I wasn't trying to copy, and it was still my own thing because it was my own medium, but I clearly from studying it was really picking up on his composition and his eye for line and shape. So it doesn't have to, I think that's, we get too afraid of copying. And if you're like, oh my gosh, it looks like I totally just ripped them off, then just keep it for yourself. Like, no one cares.
The other trick that I use that I think is really helpful is I've noticed if I'm going to have a lot of times a good painting session is something that happens after I've spent an hour looking at cool stuff on Pinterest or looking at some cool books. But so what I do is, I don't print things. I don't hang my inspiration in my workspace. I don't hang it in my studio. So I'm looking at things and I'm bringing in all that information, but when it's coming out, it has to come out through my head, not translated through something in front of me. So that kind of really, I think, takes away the copying impulse because I'm not looking at anything when I'm working, but I've built up that bank of images in my mind. Mm-hmm. And so then lots of stuff just comes out.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it's just really, it's really interesting, and it also shows how clear you are on what your style is, that in all the jewelry you design, in your paintings, and now in your textiles, that it all looks like it came from you. How did you go about developing this kind of very specific aesthetic and brand that you can run it into everything that you do?
So I wish that I could say that I did it on Pinterest because I feel like that's the clearest picture of my brand, but I didn't. I developed it long before Pinterest existed. Mm-hmm. But it really was a process of being I like, I don't like, I don't like. But now I actually sort of have words that I use that sort of become a filter for me. And so actually for me, contrast is a really big word as far as my design aesthetic. So I'm always looking for sort of how can I play with with contrast in some way? And then how do I keep things modern? Like that's sort of my other word. So I'm always sort of like, okay, I don't like I'm not girly, but I'm not minimal. And it's really just sort of also not being afraid to kind of like express an opinion. And I think that's where contrast becomes a big word for me. Is it's like, you know what? Like I want to be a little bit bold. Like I don't want to be bland. I don't want to be sort of like boring. And so if everything that I do, I think is sort of inspired by this boldness, and that really I think means that I'm not going to play it safe in a design. And sometimes that means things go disastrously. But it also, I think, gives me this really clear aesthetic because I'm drawn to things that are much more bold, but in, I think, sort of like a refined and sophisticated way. And again, that just really also, I feel like I can't emphasize enough, like looking at stuff is how you develop that. Like I really am committed to taking in so much information. I'm on Pinterest. I'm looking at books. I'm going to museums all the time. I'm not, you and I have had this conversation before. I'm not like an inspired by nature girl. I think because I live in the country and I'm like, oh, nature, like I'm so over it. Because when you live like on a farm, whatever, nature's everywhere. But so for me, it's like all of those like cultural things that I just feel like I have to constantly feed myself and constantly look. And I think the more you look, then the less likely you are to copy one person because you've got so many influences. And then I'm also, I think about what I like and what I don't like. Okay, I didn't like that. Why not? Or like, oh, I really loved that. Why did you really love it? If I go to a show and that show, at a museum and that show blows me away, I'm going to think about why, what it is that blew me away, because that probably means that it's something that is really important to me and is going to come out in my aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Did you, as you were, you started and you were doing a lot of jewelry and that was mainly like your focus. And then you started to shift into painting and then you shifted into textiles. And so like you said, right now you might only be designing jewelry for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Did you find it, kind of hard or almost like you felt guilty as you were, sort of leaving one behind and bringing a new one in?
So yes and no. So I feel like yes, when I talk to, like, yes, I feel guilty when I talk to people and they're like, oh, but like, like I love your jewelry. Apparently my phone really thinks that I still need to go for a walk. So, people, I feel like there's a sort of thing of like, oh, I actually make, not to toot my horn, but I make really great jewelry. And I know this because people tell me how much they love it. And so there is this sort of kind of guilty feeling of like, well, I'm actually really good at that. So like, who am I to walk away from it for a while because I'm so good at it. But when I actually sit down and examine sort of like the trajectory of my life, to expect me to just make jewelry forever is a little bit ludicrous. So in undergrad, the metal studio and the fiber studio were actually right next door to each other, kind of like right, they were joining just down the hall. And I spent probably almost as much time in the fiber studio as I did in the metal studio. And the joke in the metal studio was that I was the metalsmithing major who never worked with metal. Like I was doing all these weird fiber processes. I was bringing in all these alternative materials. And so it's sort of like, it's always kind of been, this thing where I've really been drawn to a lot of different stuff. And then I feel like as I got out into the world, and I think especially the kind of the professional craft world, you almost get forced into, one medium or one.
I like that basically you got really, really clear on what you like and what you believe in, and then those are the rules you have to follow, and that is allowed to go anywhere that it feels like